Welcome back to the Argentina Project podcast at the Wilson Center's Latin American program. I am your host, Benjamin Gedan. My guest today is Thomaz Favaro. He's director for the Southern Cone at Control Risks. We discuss Walmart's exit from Argentina and what it says about the business climate in South America's second largest economy. Thomaz Favaro, director for the Southern Cone for Control Risks. Thank you so much for joining us on the Argentina Project podcast.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thomaz, we are talking today about the surprise decision, or maybe not so surprising, of Walmart leaving the Argentine market. I say surprise because it's a big player there. As you know, it's been operating in Argentina since 1995. It had 92 stores. It was the 9th biggest private employer in the entire country, with a presence in 21 of 23 provinces, owned 12% of all supermarkets. You get the idea. It was a major player, and it no longer will be. My question for you is whether we should be sort of in shock at the implications of this for Argentina, or just consider this, an idiosyncratic decision of one company that, just 2 years ago also left the Brazil market. Is this a story of one company that's sort of reorganizing, or are we really talking about an indictment of the investment climate in Argentina with, labor challenges, high inflation, a unpredictable regulatory environment, and all the other factors that really may have contributed to Walmart's announcement?
You're right in pointing out there are many company decisions that at this moment may be seen as an indictment, but may not necessarily be, in reality, a decision on the business environment itself. It's very true that some global companies are rethinking their strategy in Latin America, and others that have recently departed Argentina have even filed for bankruptcy in other jurisdictions. So there are a whole range of factors at play. But I think it would be wise to understand the broader picture. There is not just a retail company that's leaving Argentina. Several airlines, manufacturing plants are being shut down. Auto parts, pharmaceutical companies. So many multinationals are leaving Argentina or have been leaving Argentina in the past 2 to 3 years. That it's very clear that something is wrong with the business environment there, or certainly very challenging for so many companies, right? And I think it's understandable if you look, for example, at the economic slowdown, the rising unemployment, and this, the diminishing purchasing power of the population brought by COVID. This is impacting, Argentina. It is also impacting other countries, but the Argentine economy will contract by 11% this year. This is one of the sharpest drops in Latin America itself. If you look at, for example, the way other companies do businesses, they really struggle, for example, to match rising costs because of inflation, stability, because they're unable to pass on this cost to clients and consumers. Other companies face severe delays in importing due to growing protectionism. Others struggle to capitalize on the foreign exchange difference because of the capital controls that are currently in place, and they make the peso, particularly overvalued. Many other companies are struggling with government regulations concerning price controls. That includes retailers, but includes also food producers, telecommunication companies. There are other regulatory risks also, if you look at export taxes or the restrictions on laying off personnel. And even then, those who, despite all that, do make a profit, they also have a hard time finding ways to repatriate that dividend to their home countries. So it's really quite a challenging environment. And I think it's no surprise that so many companies are rethinking their strategy for Argentina specifically.
You get the sense that this is a severe blow to Argentina. I mean, the company is not just closing shop, right? It's a sale and acquisition. Presumably, many of its 92 stores will continue to operate. It had 9,000 employees. Many of them may be, kept on. So what is really the impact? Are we talking about a reputational damage? Does Argentina sit back and say, okay, well, eventually we'll get out of this now third year of recession, and, retail will recover and other players will come flooding back in? Or, is this a moment of real anxiety if you're a policymaker in Argentina and you see that, such a well-known global brand has decided to lock, stock, and barrel leave your market?
Yeah, obviously, inflation watchers are very much concerned about anything related, to food production and food distribution. That makes significant component of the inflation index. But I think you pointed out just some interesting developments. This is ultimately an exit where these assets will be. Are being sold to another company, so they will not be exactly shut down. So I think sort of the doomsday scenario is a bit far-fetched when it comes to anticipating sort of the likely consequences. But it's certainly a severe reputational blow. I think many business leaders, they rely on companies like Control Risks to understand the political risk environment, but they also read the newspaper, and they see companies, company after company, rethinking their Argentine strategy, or even thinking twice or three times before investing or reinvesting in the country, and that certainly doesn't bode well for future FDI.
We've seen, some brain drain to Uruguay, including from Argentine-owned companies, and there's been this fear that a lot of Argentine money and maybe even corporate headquarters are moving across the Rio de la Plata. The Uruguayans, in fact, are encouraging Argentines to physically move to Uruguay, where they're promised greater regulatory stability, currency stability, and less political risk overall. Let's focus, because this is your expertise, on the multinationals, and particularly in retail. Is this the tip of the iceberg? Do we think this is the beginning of a much broader reassessment of Argentina after a short period of high optimism under the last pro-market government that obviously did not pan out?
Yes, so I think there's the contrast with Uruguay insofar as political stability, and I think political risk more broadly. It's starker by the day. You see the Uruguay being sort of probably the best example and the best story to the fighting COVID in Latin America. Really, really thorough work done by the Uruguayan society in overcoming that challenge much better than any other country in Latin America. And you see election was very much fiercely fought, but also extremely democratic, clean, and very well respected. And I think in many ways an example for so many Latin American nations. But there are things that Argentina has that currently, that Uruguay will never have. Starting with the market size, this is such a huge critical factor for so many companies. Depending on the size of the multinational, Argentina is often at the point where it's a market too big to ignore. Obviously, you do have to hedge your bets and understand, to what extent you want to have so much exposure to a market that provides you with such a dangerous cocktail of political risks that, to be honest, is comparatively very rare among emerging markets. This is really, really challenging place to do business. But at the same time, I guess so many of the, sort of the natural resources available in Argentina and the market size, do still make it for a compelling argument for, other companies who continue to operate in quite a profitable manner in the country.
Tomas, before we finish, I want to move on to another aspect of the investment climate, and that's transparency and regulatory risk, corruption. Control Risks produces a corruption index looking at how governments in Latin America are doing in controlling corruption. Argentina is not typically a high performer on your index or other similar analyses. How much is that a factor when your clients think about what markets to invest in Latin America? You've just said it may be too big to ignore, and so that there's so much money to be earned that maybe people are willing to stomach the risk. But I do wonder how much that weighs on those boardroom conversations when alternatives seem to be moving a little bit more in a transparent direction. And Argentina, under its current government, seems to have slowed some of the initiatives that we saw in recent years to improve access to public records, to increase independence of the judiciary, to give a sense that contracts can be enforced and you'll have a autonomous judicial process to resolve disputes.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So Controllers developed an index together with the American Society, Council of the Americas, called the Capacity to Combat Corruption Index, which measures, countries' capacity to combat and deter corruption in 15 Latin American countries. This year, we did last year with a smaller sample of countries. And Argentina was kind of like halfway. It was sixth among those 15. I think is relatively not bad position. Certainly could do better. If you consider other factors, in terms of GDP per capita, Argentina is in a much better position than most other countries in the region. But I think some of the key concern that we highlight there, I think you already touched on the lack of independence in the judiciary, the growing politicization of anti-corruption agencies, and so many factors that make, I guess, the country overall relatively weak in enforcing its anti-corruption laws, which on paper actually look pretty okay. This is a critical factor, but I would not say it's as a determinant factor because, like I mentioned earlier, I don't think Argentina is that much of an outlier. I think the index shows how, even though Argentina does have some places or areas for improvement, it does have some strengths, particularly, this is a very democratic nation. In the end of the day, scores relatively well in our, democracy index, sub-indicator of the index, sorry. So obviously corruption risks are very important for multinational investors, but I wouldn't overemphasize this as being an impediment for business in Argentina itself. First, because even though the country does have, some issues specifically associated with the politicization of regulatory anti-corruption enforcement bodies, it does have some strengths to speak to, and that's the reason why it's in the middle of the ranking. And also because there are many measures can take, to build up compliance programs that mitigate that corruption risk, even in high-risk countries. And this is something that I think Control Risk has a lot of expertise with. It's nevertheless always a problem and always a challenge. And I think particularly for those companies who are operating in areas where the provincial governments have more direct control, so particularly extractives, that tends to be a more challenging proposition for multinationals when having to deal with some of these provincial governments, many of which do have a pretty negative track record insofar as integrity, transparency, and corruption are concerned.
Thomaz Favaro, Director for the Southern Cone for Control Risks, joining us from Sao Paulo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you for listening to the Argentina Project podcast. This episode was produced and edited by Oscar Cruz. For more on this subject, visit our website, wilsoncenter.org/LAP.